Hello, my name is Devontae Lewis, and I am the executive producer of Stop Addiction Relapse. This is the first presentation in our series where we give those who are struggling with addiction or sobriety and their families definitive answers about how to permanently put an end to chemical use. If you have been a patient in multiple chemical dependency treatment facilities or have struggled to maintain sobriety after multiple attempts with 12-step programs, Stop Addiction Relapse is where you'll find the information you need to put an end to drug and alcohol use permanently and indefinitely. As your host, I am here with academic scholar Michael Tucker, who is an expert in addiction science and the author of the book How Freud, Jung, and Wilson Cured Addiction, and the Treatment Industry Closes Ears, a peer-reviewed analysis of the brain. Mr. Tucker, thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Mr. Tucker, you have suggested in your book that the cure for addiction has existed for hundreds of years, yet those who operate in treatment facilities swear that addictions represent a disease that is chronic and incurable. Could you please explain the reason for that contradiction and give more insight to our viewers on why you are qualified to dispute an obvious multi-billion-dollar industry?
Absolutely. Devontae, not everyone who enters a treatment facility or goes to AA or NA meetings actually want to live chemical-free all their lives. But for those who do, it is an extremely difficult task without the correct diagnosis and the correct information. So let me begin by stating my qualifications to take on the theory of a multi-billion-dollar industry. I'm a summa cum laude graduate in the field of psychology. I earned my Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences degree at Texas A&M University, San Antonio in San Antonio, Texas. And I was awarded a Master of Science degree in psychology after completing graduate studies at Arizona State University. My undergraduate bachelor's degree carries an emphasis in chemical dependency counseling because I'd originally enrolled in a college human services program to become a licensed chemical dependency counselor.
So what happened? Obviously, you changed your major to psychology.
Yes, and thankfully I did. I was encouraged to do so by one of my professors because that's when I found something I never could have anticipated. All of the research findings which show that addiction can be cured are in the files of documented psychological research. That information is not being shared with those who are being licensed to counsel addicts and alcoholics.
But why do you think that information is not being shared with those people who would be entrusted to counsel those suffering with addictions?
Because like you said, addiction treatment is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And insurance companies pay more money for medical claims related to chronic illnesses than they do those that are cured. So, and let me say this right now, addiction is not a disease. Addiction is a curable personality disorder that self-extinguishes under the right treatment. And I explain all of that in my book, How Freud, Jung, and Wilson Cured Addiction and the Treatment Industry Closed Its Ears, a peer-reviewed analysis of the brain. And let me say this also, emphatically and without the slightest bit of hyperbole. I was cured of addiction and alcoholism back in 2001 after 13 years going in and out of 12-step program meetings and admission to 4 different treatment facilities. When I suddenly stopped binge drinking and using cocaine, I honestly did not know why. So after 11 years living soberly, I enrolled in college in order to understand how a person who at one point in his life could not resist spending every single dime he had on drugs and alcohol could somehow be transformed back to a pre-addiction state as if he'd never drank or used drugs before in his life.
Wow. Man, that's truly remarkable, but how did the others know, how did the others that knew about your previous struggles accept the change in your life? What was their opinion of the new you?
Believe it or not, Devontae, they're still waiting for me to relapse back into binge drinking and cocaine use. Even though they can read in the AA Big Book that Dr. Carl Jung, one of the most celebrated and venerated psychologists in history, stated that cures for addiction had occurred throughout history. They simply refused to believe that it could happen to me. Well, it's been over 23 years now and counting. I hope they're not holding their breath waiting for me to wind up on Skid Row.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
But more importantly is this. Once I had identified the theoretical basis and scientific approach, which would eventually be presented in my book, I offered my thesis for review to every PhD level academic and research in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, and chemical dependency who would take the time to give me their unvarnished opinions. They would include professors at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, Beverly Watts Davis, a former director of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and also Dr. John Roach, who at the time was the chief of psychiatry division over alcohol and addictions at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio. And after conversations with these high-level academics and researchers, I found that the conclusions I had reached were irrefutable. They cannot be scientifically contradicted. Later, I was able to demonstrate the methodology on volunteers who had been considered hopeless cases relative to their past attempts at sobriety with marvelous results. Now, all of this I explain in my book, which, by the way, makes 12-step meeting attendance still useful, but no longer mandatory.
How so?
Well, Devontae, when I was cured of addiction and alcoholism, it means that I can make the decision to never take another drink or use another drug ever again in life. The craving and compulsion to use chemicals is completely eliminated indefinitely. Now, that doesn't mean that people won't have the choice to be stupid if they want to. But what it means is that there are those people who truly believe that their lives depend on them staying abstinent from all chemical use forever, and they don't want to struggle with it. They want to feel that rejecting alcohol and drugs is as natural as breathing fresh air. So when I decided to solve the addiction problem myself, I made it my goal to become educated enough to tell the world in scientific terms exactly what happens to the brains of those people who are suffering with addictions, because that's where the problem lives. And besides my education, I've actually experienced addiction and cure. So if anyone watches the entire series of Stop Addiction Relapse videos, he or she will become acquainted with the only accurate diagnosis of the addiction disorder. With study of my book and the videos, any individual will be able to arrest an addictive cycle. As a matter of fact, because the research findings referenced in my book are produced by the top peer-reviewed scientists in the world, any individual with at least a bachelor's degree in psychology would be able to outline a group of therapy practices that would deliver anyone from the grips of addiction.
Anyone. You can guarantee that.
Devontae, anyone who truly wants to stop chemical use indefinitely will have their willpower restored, and if they're willing to follow instructions, they will stop and they will stay stopped, and that much is guaranteed.
Now, there you have it from academic scholar Michael Tucker. Now, here we are into the first lesson.
Hello, I'm Michael Tucker, and this is the first lesson in our series, video series, Stop Addiction Relapse. If you're watching because you've been struggling to stay clean and sober after multiple treatment facility admissions and 12-step meetings, I want you to know that I've been exactly where you are. I've struggled exactly the way that you have. Now, I've made it my life's work to explain to you exactly what is preventing you from maintaining long-term abstinence from chemical use and enjoying sobriety. So let's begin with the most fundamental issues. The fact is, if you've been to multiple treatment facilities and gone to AA meetings, one thing that I know for sure is that you have never actually been told what is wrong with you. You have never been told exactly what you're struggling with. So let me clarify the issue right now. If you're an addict and alcoholic, you have a hypersensitivity to stress, which means that you are more sensitive to stress than other people in the society. Now, This problem is not just emotional. It is emotional and it is biological because it affects the brain. And that's why just going to AA meetings or just going through treatment has never solved the problem. The hypersensitivity to stress is what drives drug use. Okay? So your response to stress is what's driving drug use and relapse. Now, why am I saying all of that? Okay. Now, addiction is a curable personality disorder which involves these two dynamics, which is a hypersensitivity to stress and a respondent overstimulation of the pleasure center in the brain. And that's what you're doing with the drug use. You're responding to the stress problem by using the chemical. Now, where the treatment industry has always had it wrong is that they've always been putting the cart before the horse. They've always been telling you that all you need to focus on is to stop the drug use and you would stop relapsing. That is not true, okay? So, over the years, the entire science concerning addiction has changed because of brain imaging technology. And none of that information is being brought forth even in college human services programs where individuals are being licensed to counsel addicts and alcoholics. Brain imaging technology has brought forth the understanding that stress is tied to a chemical in the brain called cortisol. Okay? Now, because the treatment industry has never changed its strategy, okay, they've been doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result, which we know is called insanity. Okay? So they continue to say that addiction is chronic and incurable because they're making relapse a moral issue rather than a medical issue. Okay? But if you want to stop the scourge of relapse, you must make hypersensitivity to stress, okay, your primary focus, because chemical use is only a symptom of this. That's why you use the drug. Now, I want to explain to you exactly why I'm saying this. Your brain is where addiction takes place, and the chemicals in your brain are driving the addiction because of stress and not pleasure. Okay? Now, I know you have heard of triggers, because I know I heard about it so many different times. A person is going to AA or NA meetings. He or she has gone to a 30-day treatment program. Everything seems to be going fine. They go as far as to get a new job or something, and they get a paycheck, and then they go out on a binge. And from that point on, they're told, oh, that paycheck that you got was a trigger. Okay? There's no validity to that. And that's why I explain exactly how and why cortisol dysregulation causes addiction in my book, How Freud, Jung, and Wilson Cured Addiction and the Treatment Industry Closed Its Ears, a peer-reviewed analysis of the brain. So if you're an addict or an alcoholic, you're relapsing because of a mechanism in your brain called the HPA axis, the HPA axis, okay? And this mechanism, which involves the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, is what triggers the release of the hormone cortisol into the blood, into the bloodstream. Now let me explain to you why that's so important, okay? With every individual on this planet who comes under stress experiences the release of cortisol into the bloodstream. Why? Because this chemical, this hormone, is what causes us to make a decision called the fight or flight response. So imagine yourself coming up to a vicious dog, a pit bull. The pit bull is loose, it's running around. You see the dog sees you, and immediately you come under the stress of the thought the dog will probably bite me. Now, cortisol begins to be released into your bloodstream at that thought, okay? Now, you have to make a decision. Am I going to fight the dog? Am I going to run from the dog? Am I going to scream for help? But a decision has to be made, and that's what cortisol does. It causes me to make that decision. Now, let's just say the owner of the dog sees the dog that's about to bite me, runs over, grabs the dog by the neck, puts the chain on the dog, and drags the dog back into the fence. Now, the stressor has now been eliminated, right? Yeah, the stressor has now been eliminated. Right. Okay. Now, in the normal person's brain, there's what's called a negative feedback loop where cortisol gets shut off. Why? Because the stressor is no longer there. Okay? But in the drug addict's brain and the alcoholic's brain, cortisol does not shut off. Instead, cortisol becomes dysregulated. It becomes dysregulated. And that's just a fancy word for saying that the level of cortisol in the addict and alcoholic's blood stays at a higher level than in that of the general population that are not suffering with addictions or alcoholism. Okay? Now, why is that important? That's important because cortisol has only one purpose, and that is the fight or flight response. Its only purpose is to deal with stress. But if cortisol is not shut off in the system, if cortisol becomes dysregulated, as they have found in the populations of those suffering with addict addictions and alcoholism, cortisol becomes a poison. Yeah. And it makes the addict and the alcoholic sick. Cortisol in the system, unrelated to a stressful environment, becomes a poison. What does it do? It breaks down the immune system. The individual makes it easier for an individual addict or an alcoholic to get sick. It causes an imbalance in blood sugar, which what could be more dangerous than dealing with blood sugar problems? That causes an individual to plunge into a state of depression. It causes decreased resistance to infections. It causes weakness in the bones. So The individual who is relapsing is not relapsing because of pleasure. They're relapsing because cortisol is dysregulated in the blood system. He or she is walking around sick, okay? Walking around sick and using the chemical in response. Now, this is what brain imaging technology has done. Brain imaging technology began to come in back in the 80s and the 70s, late 70s and 80s, beginning with positive emission tomography, what's called a PET scan, and functional magnetic resonance imaging. And because of the PET scans and functional magnetic resonance imaging, because of those technologies, they began to be able to see the brain working in real time. And that's why they've been able to identify cortisol dysregulation in the populations of those who are suffering with addictions and alcoholism. Now, in 1997, the National Institutes of Health released a report on addiction and alcoholism called Project Match, stating that every single victim is affected by major depression or persistent depressive disorder, general anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is the kind of information that is needed for individuals to overcome relapse. But these are the type of issues that are never discussed in AA meetings or NA meetings or in general treatment facilities. So cortisol existing, being dysregulated, sometimes scientists call it a blunted response. Now, cortisol does some other things too. Besides making an individual sick, what it does is, get this. It increases the craving for drugs and alcohol. So how can you stop relapsing if you're suffering with cortisol dysregulation? It's impossible. Okay, that's why with all the studies that they've done, they'll tell you today that only 2 to 3% of the people who go to AA or NA meetings are going to survive. Because remember, addiction and alcoholism are terminal illnesses. Okay? So the reason why you're craving to use the chemical, because the dysregulation of cortisol is making you sick. And nobody ever told you. Okay? So you might ask, well, why am I going to all these AA meetings, these 12-step meetings? You've been told that's supposed to be the solution. Because 12-step meetings offer an opportunity to relieve stress. There you go. the stress. That's why you go to AA and A meetings, because it's like a balloon. Addiction has a person like a balloon. Life goes on for the alcoholic and the drug addict. Okay? Alcoholics and drug addicts still have marital problems, still have economic problems, still have employment problems, still have problems with motor vehicles, relationships with children. So every day that the addict and the alcoholic gets up and starts living life because he has a hypersensitivity to stress, it's like a balloon. He gets up one day, he goes to work, he has a difference of opinion with his boss. The balloon starts getting blown up. He has car problems later in the week. The balloon gets larger. He has some differences with his wife or his significant other. The balloon gets even larger. Now, the individual goes to AA meeting, or say NA, okay, right? And what does it do? He goes there, he listens to other people, he talks out problems, and what? He lets the air out of the balloon. Okay? That's it. So you can keep doing that as long as it lasts, but at some point in time, when the individual stops going to the meetings, the balloon continues to blow up until it finally explodes. And what happens? The individual relapse. Right? Why? Because going to AA or NA meetings does nothing to solve the problem of going to AA or NA doesn't solve the problem of cortisol dysregulation. For that, you have to have therapy practices. And those therapy practices are listed in this book in order to have this problem solved. This problem has to be solved in the brain. Therapeutic practices will do the job. They're listed in the book. How Freud, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Bill Wilson cured addiction, and the treatment industry closed its ears, a peer-reviewed analysis of the brain. Okay. Now, let me explain why it hits home with me so much. My 13 years in and out of 12-step meetings and admission to 4 different treatment facilities, I had some friends in these programs. I had some friends in these meetings. Tawanda Johnson, Matt, and Ron Snell. And each one of them committed their lives to going to 12-step meetings. Matt relapsed and died of aspiration pneumonia. He relapsed, got drunk, began to vomit, and breathed the vomit into his lungs, and it killed him. Tawanda Johnson was found stabbed to death in her apartment. Ron Snell, after a relapse, was found with his throat cut. Now, I'd never seen anyone more committed than these people to going to AA and NA meetings. But they did not survive. And they did not survive because nobody had ever told them about this. That until that problem is solved, okay, relapse is going to occur. Okay? So the issue is that because of brain imaging, now we can actually tell what the mindset of an addict or an alcoholic is before they relapse. Okay? Every alcoholic and addict, before he relapses, he goes through a process of stress, fear. Begins with fear. Some type of fear. Fear of my job, maybe I'm gonna lose my job. Fear I'm gonna lose my wife, fear I'm gonna lose my money. Fear brings stress, which brings resentment, which brings ruminations. I call this the NIC cycle, the negative impact emotional cycle. Because this is repeated over and over in the addict and the alcoholic's mind until they get drunk or get high off of drugs. Experience of fear, stress, develop resentments or hatred, ruminations. And ruminations is my desire for revenge. I want to get back at them. I'm going to do this. They said that. It's that repeated, what people used to call the S committee. I don't want to say the word. The S committee is meeting up in the mind of the alcoholic and the addict. Okay? And this is what it was termed before people even understood that this is the cycle. But every individual who relapses ends up with this cycle. And it goes round and round until they get drunk. And that begins with the dysregulation of cortisol. That's why that occurs. Okay? So in order for me to put an end to relapses, I must be delivered from ever feeling that I want to use chemicals, which means that I must take therapeutic action to disrupt this, and this is not disrupted as long as cortisol is dysregulated in the system. That's why you should get this book and follow the instructions. You'll stop relapsing. Now, this does not mean that pleasure from chemical use has no role in addiction. Pleasure has a role in addiction because your reaction to the hypersensitivity to stress caused by cortisol dysregulation is what drives you to get the drug. Okay? What we're saying is that, and what has been proved out, is that this NIC cycle and cortisol dysregulation are the primary causes of relapse. Now, the stimulation of the pleasure center in the brain, and that's going to be in the next lesson. We're going to talk about that. But the stimulation of the pleasure center in the brain is the secondary cause of relapse, and only relevant because addiction and alcoholism are tied to your sexuality. So, if anyone watching this series is a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a therapist, who is counseling or treating those who are suffering with a substance use disorder. I'm challenging you to investigate the research findings referenced in my book, How Freud, Jung, and Wilson Cured Addiction and the Treatment Industry Closed Its Ears, a peer-reviewed analysis of the brain. Help me to stop the charade of calling addiction an incurable illness, a curable chronic illness. The technology is here, the science is here, and the instruction is here. So if you, the psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, or if you have at least a bachelor's degree in psychology, will integrate Gestalt therapy, person-centered therapy, and existential therapy, and you know what I'm referring to, and apply them based upon the instructions in my book, you will have the capacity to deliver any individual from the grips of the addiction cycle indefinitely. Now, this brings us to the conclusion of the first lesson in this series. What I've shared with you in this first lesson are a few of the major issues in my book directed toward eliminating relapse. Namely, that cortisol dysregulation is the primary driving force of relapse potential. All of the other information in my book is for the person who needs to know everything about the addiction disorder, whether they suffer with a substance use disorder or a treatment professional or a 12-step layman. So let me encourage you, those of you who want to overcome the risk of relapse, if you are being counseled by a chemical dependency treatment professional in a facility, or you're engaged in a 12-step program with a sponsor, tell them to get this book and go through it with you. If they won't do it, get away from them and find someone who will. Now, addiction sexuality will be the subject of the second lesson in this series. I hope that you will watch and consider it carefully. Have a great day. Hello again. My name is Michael Tucker, and this is the second lesson in the Stop Addiction Relapse series. And the subject of this lesson is addiction sexuality. Now, what we learned in the first lesson is that the primary motivation behind relapse is the dysregulation of the hormone cortisol in the brain. Now, we want to look at the secondary motivation for addiction, which the treatment industry has always focused on as primary, and that's why there's never been a solution to the problem. Addiction is a curable personality disorder that self-extinguishes under the right treatment. But the treatment industry has continued to insist that it is chronic and incurable, making it a moral issue and therefore making it unsolvable. Okay? But we're not going to put the cart before the horse as they are. We're going to put the cart in front of the horse, and cortisol dysregulation is what's driving the primary. Now, the pleasure center in the brain is called the limbic region, and in this limbic region, it regulates both your stress reaction and your sexuality. Okay? Now, so there are two hormones actually that are involved in that from an area of the brain called the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. And of course, the first hormone is called cortisol. The other one is called, that's dealing with sexuality, is called oxytocin. Okay. Now, this is what you're dealing with, the hypersensitivity to stress and the overstimulation of the pleasure center in the brain, okay? Because both cortisol and oxytocin are released from the same area in the brain, and oxytocin compels sexual behavior. Now, if you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or hold a degree in psychology watching this video, then you especially want to pay particular attention to the research findings referenced in my book regarding sexuality and addiction if you are assisting anyone with recovery. Now, Dr. Patrick Carnes, the father of sex addiction research, documented the fact that sexuality and addiction are intertwined. And his research found that almost half of all sex addicts suffer with drug or alcohol addiction, and 7 out of 10 cocaine addicts are also sex addicts. Your addiction and alcoholism are inextricably tied to your sexuality. Now, why is this important? Because whenever you use alcohol or any other mind-altering substance or chemical, it is stimulating the exact same region in the brain that's stimulated through sexual activity. Okay? So what does that mean? So yes, when you're in the throes of addiction or an alcoholic binge, okay, you're using chemicals to have sex with yourself. Yes, to put in just in a bottom line phrase, okay? Because the same area of the brain that is regulating sexuality, you're stimulating that area every time that you use methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, even nicotine, wine, beer, the ethanol in wine, beer, and liquor. Okay? So what does it mean to overstimulate the pleasure center in the brain? You keep going through the hypersensitivity of stress, and you keep doing things that overstimulate the pleasure in the center in the brain because you're sick. Okay, and the sickness is called by cortisol dysregulation we talk about in the first video. Okay? So what it means when you're overstimulating this area, it means that you're bombarding that area of your brain with sexually stimulating behaviors, and it in fact is driving you insane. It begins with the dysregulation of cortisol in the stress area, but that drives the individual toward the chemical, and the chemical then begins to drive the person insane. Now, you want to observe insanity? Let me give you an example of how you can observe some insanity. Watch the person who drinks alcohol, smokes marijuana, smokes cigarettes, does coke or meth, has sex, watches porn, and masturbates. That person is going insane. The pleasure center in his brain, what's called the mesocortical limbic dopamine pathway, okay, is being overstimulated, and it drives an individual insane. So unless you take action to restrain your sexual impulse, because that is what's actually out of control. And I understand the focus of the drug. This is what the treatment industry always wants to tell you, is that, you know, he's a drug addict because he likes to do drugs. He loves the pleasure in doing drugs. He loves the pleasure. He loves the euphoria from drinking the alcohol. The ethanol produces this euphoria. It affects the central nervous system. You get high, okay? And they're stuck on that, and they're continually telling you that that's what the problem is. So you focusing on the drug without focusing on your sexuality, you are not going to have any type of an opportunity to recover. You're going to relapse all your life until you're dead. So unless you take action to restrain your sexual impulse, because that is what is out of control, you'll never recover. In other words, you've been taught to restrain the impulse to drink a drug when the core of the addiction personality disorder has to do with whether or not you will restrain the amount of your sexual stimulation. Now, that is why some of you might remember old-timers in 12-step programs telling you not to get into a relationship until you've been sober for at least 1 year. There's a common theme that is talked about in virtually all AA or NA circles. Okay? Now, one absolute reason why some people will never stay clean or sober is because the secondary factor of the addiction personality disorder is that he or she has a belief that they're in a competition with the world as to who is the greatest at having sex. Okay? Yeah. Dr. Patrick Carnes mentioned that in his book. Yes, consciously or subconsciously, he or she wants to be the world champion of sex when sex is an instinct. It is not a recreational or athletic competition. Okay? True sexuality is driven by intimacy. Okay? Not acrobatics. Okay? So if you're tempted to stay clean and sober, but regularly watch pornography or go to strip clubs, you won't ever recover. Watching pornography has the same effect on the central nervous system of the brain as drinking alcohol or using any other psychoactive drug. So that is one huge issue. But now, let's get down into the deepest level of why that's important. You see, the overstimulation of the brain's pleasure center affects the signaling. The signaling in the brain. Okay. We all operate because of the signals that are being passed back and forth to the different areas of our brain. I can see because the occipital lobe, which is in the back of my head, right, which is in the back of my head, is communicating with what's called the prefrontal cortex. And then, of course, with the rods and the cones in my eyes, and which allows the absorption of electromagnetic energy, which we call light, into the eye so that I can see. Now, this signaling, that signaling has a huge impact on thought processes, especially the thought processes of whether or not to use the drug. So what happens is, the thoughts of drug use are allowed to come into the mind because this signaling shuts off certain messages that come into the mind. And it allows other messages to come through. Now what it does is it shuts off all of the thoughts that tell me to stop using drugs and alcohol. See, it shuts this down. See, It shuts it down. So these thoughts, the thoughts that normally tell me, hey, you know what? Your family needs that money. You can't go out and party on that money. You can't go out and use that cocaine. You can't go drinking with your buddies. You got your rent to pay. You got your car note to pay, right? Those messages are shut down. And the only messages that come through are the thoughts of drug use and the pleasure involved. Now, that was first discovered among a group of a population of methamphetamine addicts. Some researchers found that because of the signaling in the brain having become impaired because of the overstimulation of the pleasure center, in their minds, the meth addicts could never ever connect the chemical use with a bad outcome. Everything that came into their mind only was an expression of the euphoria that they would experience and the thrill that they would get from the use of the chemical. But as far as how sick they were becoming, how sick they were making their family members, the last time they did drugs and damaged some things, and none of that would come into the mind. It was being impeded. And that is a direct result of the overstimulation of the pleasure center in the brain. So the alcoholic or addict's brain takes advantage of the overstimulation of the pleasure center by retarding the amount of information signals that are sent to the mind. Now what that means is that the neurons or nerve cells in your brain starts blocking the signals that tell you to stop using alcohol or drugs, and blocks the memories of the catastrophes that one's addiction has brought about. The brain stops sending signals which says, don't use a drink because you remember when you wrecked the car or got a DUI. Instead, the brain bombards the addict or alcoholic's brain with messages only of how intensely pleasurable using or drinking will be. Okay? So this restructuring of the neurons in the brain is the result of what is called neuroplasticity. Okay? The brain changes, the brain restructures, the brain restructures with two things: new experiences and new information. Yeah. So that's how that occurs. Okay? And overstimulation of the pleasure center in the brain is the secondary cause of relapse because it is engineered by cortisol being dysregulated. So even if you stop using chemicals, you go to 90 AA or NA meetings meetings in 90 days. And that's when years ago when I went to my first meetings beginning back in 1988. That's what we were told. They drilled it into us. Go to 90 meetings in 90 days. Do 12-step work. Engage in sponsorship or any of the behaviors you're encouraged to follow. You will still relapse until that next cycle that we talked about in the first video has been disrupted and the brain's pleasure center is no longer being overstimulated. Okay? So now you understand the reason why you've heard in AA or NA circles stories about how individuals relapsed after what appeared to be long-term clean time and sobriety. So As I stated in the introduction, your goal is to feel that the rejection of chemical use is as natural as breathing fresh air. If you never feel that you want to drink a drug, you never will. And solving the problems of hypersensitivity to stress caused by cortisol dysregulation and restraining your sexual impulse will stop you from ever feeling like you want to drink a drug. Now I'll tell you a bit of my story. I stopped overstimulating the pleasure center in my brain by reading parts of the Bible. Leviticus chapters 18 and chapter 20 and the Bible every day. Every day I read them, and soon after I stopped binge drinking and using cocaine. That was over 23 years ago. Now let me tell you why that was so fundamental to overcoming my addiction. Because when I read those chapters, it forced me to confront what I believed about sex. And for the first time in a long time, it forced me to establish a core set of values about my own sexuality and not someone else's. I was no longer going to be bound by what my friends, my family, or American culture said sex was supposed to be about. I had to make this change because the choices I was making to enjoy my sexuality always ended up hurting me and someone else. And I continued to relapse. So I had to restrain myself by narrowing my beliefs about sex to a core set of values that did not risk hurting me or anyone else. And that turned out to be exactly what I needed in order to put the nightmare of addiction behind me forever. As a matter of fact, let's just think about the consequences of not restraining sexual impulse. Let's look at our society. Let's look at our culture, okay? What problems do we have? What? Sexually transmitted disease, right? How about this? Divorce? Yeah, this is what we get. Sexual assaults. Right? How about child sex abuse? Yeah. This comes about from everyone who makes the decision they're not going to restrain their sexuality, right? Child pornography. How about that? Child porn, right? Okay. How about abortions? Right? Teenage pregnancy. Right? Yeah. You make a decision on whether or not you want to be in the group of people who are promoting all of these things. How about children born with birth defects? Right? Birth defects. Yeah. That's the decision that you're making, right? Prostitution. Incest. Yeah. And yes, addiction. All of this goes together. Do you want to be a part of it? That's what the issue is. Okay? Now, if any of you have read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know that the 4th chapter is titled We Agnostics. The entire chapter is directed to get the alcoholic to accept the fact that if he or she does not have God's help, he or she is doomed to die from alcoholism. Remember, addiction in the vast majority of cases, some say 97%, is a terminal illness. So let me state this emphatically. You must have the help of Almighty God if you're going to survive. Not religion, not sons of God, not preachers, not teachers, the prophets. Almighty God, the Most High. Okay? The God of all gods. Let's say it like that. If you won't restrain your sexual behavior and separate yourself from the class of people who cause these problems, right? You're not going to recover because you're not going to help God's help. And that's a fact. You can forget it. So, if anyone watching this series is a psychologist, psychiatrist, or therapist who is counseling or treating those who are suffering with a substance use disorder, I'm challenging you to investigate the research findings referenced in my book titled How Freud, Jung, and Wilson Cured Addiction and the Treatment Industry Closed Its Ears. Help me to stop the charade of calling addiction an incurable chronic illness. The technology is here, the science is here, and the instruction is here. If you, the psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, or if you have at least a bachelor's degree in psychology, will integrate Gestalt therapy, person-centered therapy, and existential therapy, and you know what I'm referring to, and apply them based upon the instructions in my book, you will have the capacity to deliver any individual from the grips of an addiction cycle indefinitely. Now, this brings us to the conclusion of the second lesson in this series. What I've shared with you in this second lesson are a few of the major issues in my book directed toward eliminating relapse. Namely, that overstimulation of the pleasure center in the brain is the secondary cause of relapse. All of the other information in my book is for the person who needs to know everything about the addiction disorder, whether they suffer with a substance use disorder or a treatment professional or a 12-step layman. So let me encourage those of you who want to overcome the risk of relapse. If you're being counseled by a chemical dependency treatment professional in a facility, or you're engaged in a 12-step program with a sponsor, tell them to get my book and go through it with you. If they won't do it, get away from them and find someone who will. Now, chemical use and self-hatred will be the subject of the third lesson in this series. I hope that you will watch and consider it carefully. Have a great day. Hi again, I'm Michael Tucker, and this is the third lesson in the video series, Stop Addiction, Relapse. And this third lesson is titled Chemical Use and Self-Hatred. And the reason why it's titled that, I have some questions, such as, did you know that the World Health Organization has issued a warning stating that someone dies an alcohol-related death every 10 seconds worldwide. Are you aware that there's 6 different types of cancer that are directly related to drinking alcoholic beverages? Mouth and throat, voice box, esophagus, liver, colon and rectum, and breast cancer. In the U.S., on average, 261 people die in alcohol-related death every day. And over 10,000 people die annually directly related to drunk driving. Between 64% and 86% of all murders are committed by people under the influence of alcohol. What does that tell you? That tell you that if I decide that I want to increase my life expectancy, which is a fancy way of saying if I make the decision that I want to live longer, I only have to make one decision. I need to stop drinking. If I just do that, I have an increased life expectancy because alcohol is a poison. Okay? Now, you weren't aware of these statistics that I spoke about? Why not? Because the liquor industry pays good money to politicians in order to keep using commercial messaging to deceive people into believing that drinking alcoholic beverages is entirely safe. You see them smiling on that liquor commercial? But that is not what life is like on the ground. Okay? In 80% of the sexual assaults that occur, either the perpetrator or the victim or both have been drinking alcohol. So let me explain to you why that problem exists. Because in the brain, there is a chemical called gamma amino butyric acid, or GABA for short. Okay? Now, that chemical reacts with ethanol, which is the psychoactive substance that's in every single drop of wine, beer, and liquor that one drinks. And what does it do? It causes my inhibitions to be lowered. And what does that mean? That means I become willing to do things that I wouldn't normally do had I not been drinking. I become willing to say things that I would never say if I had not been drinking. Because of the chemical reaction, the chemical reaction between GABA and ethanol. So now you understand why some guy starts drinking and he starts acting like he's 10 feet tall and bulletproof. When you're insisting to an individual that he cannot drive that vehicle, he's going to swear to you he's not too drunk to drive, and he ends up going the wrong way on the freeway and killing somebody's grandmother. This is not a moral issue. This chemical reaction between GABA and ethanol is not a moral issue. And that may be a moral issue as to why the person started drinking, picked up the alcohol, if he knew that this reaction was going to occur. But the problem is what? That the government allows liquor producers and beer producers and wine producers to continue to bombard you with messages acting as if this does not occur. Okay? When this is killing somebody every 10 seconds. So it's not a moral issue, it's not a right or wrong issue, it's a good or bad issue. Drinking alcoholic beverages is one of the most dangerous things that an individual can do in his life. Okay? And in most cases, it's a bad idea. An individual who just looks at drinking alcohol as some type of a recreational enterprise, okay, yeah, you're going to have financial problems, you're going to have marital problems, you're going to have problems on your job. Yeah. You're going to have legal problems. Okay? Now, There's no such thing as a safe drink. But if an individual made the decision that they want to drink alcohol safely, well, what is a drink? A drink is a 12-ounce beer. That's considered one drink. 5 ounces of wine or 1 jigger, which is 1 ounce of liquor. Right? This is considered one drink. Okay? Now, in order to get one drink out of your system, it takes about 1 hour. But so, let's just paint a picture here. If you're an addict or alcoholic, when have you ever considered picking up a 12-ounce beer at 12 noon, consuming it by 12:15 p.m., and then waiting an entire hour until 1:15 p.m. before you had another beer? That never occurs to anybody. Anybody that's drinking, the chemical reaction happens between GABA and the ethanol. The individual's inhibitions are lowered. The individual begins to drink more and more alcohol. The blood alcohol concentration in the blood gets greater, and then get to the point to where an individual can even black out. And then, of course, all kinds of bad things happen. Okay? So, there's something else to be considered in here. Is that even if I want to get this out of my system, it has to be metabolized. But even when it is metabolized, to get out of my system, it has to first be transformed into a cancer, a cancer-causing agent. That's why there are 6 different cancers associated with drinking alcohol, because before the alcohol can come out of your system, it has to be transformed into what's called acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is a cancer-causing agent. And it has to become that before it can even leave the body. So why do you drink? Is it out of ignorance, or you hate yourself, or are you only being persuaded to kill yourself because of the fact that our government doesn't require liquor, wine, and beer distributors to tell you the truth that they're killing you and making you like it? Drinking alcoholic beverages kills more people in the United States than all other drugs combined. They say that nicotine, smoking has that distinction, but smoking tobacco has no connection to deaths caused by intoxication or murders. Only alcohol does. There was a Columbia University study back in 2002, and the results of that study said that if the liquor industry lost the money they get from underage drinkers, the entire industry was shut down. Why? Because the only way they can continue to rake in billions of dollars is to keep turning teenagers into alcoholics. That study is referenced in my book. All of this information I'm giving you, the research studies, the findings, they're all referenced right here. The top peer-reviewed scientists in the world are noted and referenced in this book. So Let me explain another problem with alcohol. Okay? How about alcohol poisoning? Right? Some kid goes out in March, school closes up, right? Kids go out to the beach, kids get to drinking, college kids get to drinking. Some kid drinks so much he dies. Everybody stands back and says, hey, we didn't know that he was going to die. Well, we didn't know that what we were doing could possibly cause his death. Well, let me explain to you why that happens. In the body, there's what's called the pyloric valve. That valve leads from the stomach to the small intestine. Okay? Now, when an individual drinks enough alcohol to where he throws up, what happens is the individual consumes so much alcohol that the stomach cannot hold it because it's poison. So this valve shuts, and since the stomach cannot hold the poison, the individual throws it up chucks, or whatever word you want to use for it. Now, in the individual who dies from alcoholic poisoning, that valve just failed to shut. Who has control over the valve? No one has control over the valve. No one knows if the valve is going to shut or whether or not it's going to stay open. But if the valve does not shut, the alcohol, the ethanol, a poison goes down into the small intestine, and the individual who is drinking dies. Okay? And this has happened many times. I don't know if this is the first time that anybody has ever explained this to you, but this is why you have heard of teenagers and college students going out during spring break, and then their parents having to bury some of them not long after. Aspiration pneumonia. I spoke about a friend of mine in the other video who had died from aspiration pneumonia, where he relapsed. He drank so much, he started to vomit. The stomach couldn't hold the alcohol. He began to vomit, and then he breathed the vomit into the lungs, and it killed him. That's called death by aspiration pneumonia. So, do you understand that the liquor industry is making a fool of people by selling them a poison that kills millions, killing millions, but telling them that they are dying for other reasons than alcohol? People are being murdered, raped, abusing children, getting divorced, losing jobs, losing mortgages, being forced to live in homeless shelters, in abject poverty. But that beer seller can still put a commercial on television showing young people with liquor bottles in their hands talking about having a great time. And what about cocaine? Do you know what cocaine is made of? It's not just crushed up coca leaves. There are 5 different deadly poisons used to make cocaine, including gasoline, ammonia, and sulfuric acid. And that's the kind of acid that is toxic and eats up your flesh. So think about that when somebody's telling you that they are smoking crack, or they're snorting cocaine, or they're shooting cocaine intravenously. Okay. That is a death sentence. Okay. Methamphetamine or crystal meth generally has battery acid in it. Yeah, battery acid. Okay. Now, you have to ask your question. Do you believe that one must be mentally and emotionally disturbed before they make the decision to ingest ethanol, gasoline, and battery acid? Now, I've been forced to admit that liquor producers and drug dealers have made a fool out of me from the time I was encouraged to take that first drink of drug. See? So, these are the type of considerations that an individual has to make, even with dealing with the issue of relapse. Okay? You're being bombarded with images that telling you you're going to have a great time. You've got friends, and they want to tell you we're having a good time, okay? When they're not telling you they're behind on their mortgage. Okay? They're not telling you what's going on behind closed doors. It all looks good. It all is made to appear like sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. Yeah. Cheers. Okay. But that's not what happens in the real world. Let's consider that. Now, if anyone watching this series is a psychologist, psychiatrist, or therapist who is counseling or treating those who are suffering with a substance use disorder, I'm challenging you to investigate the research findings referenced in my book titled How Freud, Jung, and Wilson Cured Addiction and the Treatment Industry Closed Its Ears. Help me stop the charade of calling addiction an incurable chronic illness. The technology is here, the science is here, and the instruction is here. If you, the psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, or if you have at least a bachelor's degree in psychology, will integrate Gestalt therapy, person-centered therapy, and existential therapy, and you know what I'm referring to, and apply them based upon the instructions in my book, you will have the capacity to deliver any individual from the grips of an addiction cycle indefinitely. Now, this brings us to the conclusion of the third and final lesson in our series. What I've shared with you in all three lessons are a few of the major items in my book directed toward eliminating relapse. All of the other information in my book is for the person who needs to know everything about the addiction disorder, whether they suffer with a substance use disorder or a treatment professional or a 12-step layman. So let me encourage those of you who want to overcome the risk of relapse. If you're being counseled by a chemical dependency treatment professional in a facility, or you're engaged in a 12-step program with a sponsor, tell them to get the book and go through it with you. If they won't do it, get away from them and find someone who will. Thank you for tuning in to the Stop Addiction Relapse video series, and the best of luck with your recovery or cure, whichever you choose.